Welcome everyone on behalf of the Numata Center for Buddhist Studies to our annual Numata Buddhist Philosophy Lecture. And this semester, Professor Christian Coseru is the Numata Visiting Professor of Buddhist Philosophy. He comes to us from the College of Charleston. Christian has wide-ranging interests in the area of philosophy of mind, phenomenology, and cross-cultural philosophy, but the reason he's here today is because of a particular interest in bringing Indian and Buddhist philosophy into conversation with contemporary Western philosophy. Christian is quintessentially cosmopolitan. He grew up on the banks of the Blue Danube in Romania, completed the equivalent of what we would call BA and MA in philosophy at the University of Bucharest. He then went on, I think I got the sequence right, he went on and spent 4.5 years in India studying Sanskrit and Indian philosophy with affiliations at the Mahabodhi Society, at the Asiatic Society of Calcutta, at the Bandekar Oriental Research Institute, at the De Nobili College in Pune, and at the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies in Sarnath, among other places. He eventually made his way to the Australian National University, where he completed his PhD, and he also spent time while he was a graduate student as a visiting scholar at Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris, among other places. I think you said that he's lived on every continent except Antarctica and Africa. So he's author of the book Perceiving Reality, Consciousness, Intentionality, and Cognition in Buddhist philosophy. He's the editor of 2 collections, Reasons and Empty Persons, Mind, Metaphysics, and Morality in 2023. And just last year, a collection, Is Subjectless Consciousness Possible?, which was a special issue in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. And this is in addition to some 36 or so articles and book chapters. He is extraordinarily productive. But his contributions to the field of cross-cultural philosophy are much greater than his publications, and I'm thinking specifically of his organization of 2 NEH Summer Institutes, one in 2012 on the topic Self-Knowledge in Eastern and Western Philosophies. I was at that one. I'd met Christian before then in Taiwan, but that was really where I got to know him. And another in 2016 on Investigating Consciousness, Buddhist and Contemporary Philosophical Perspectives. And he's planning another one for 2026. I hope that will work out. These institutes, if you are not aware of them, they will bring together some 15 specialists in a particular area, along with another 25 students, and I say students in quotation marks because typically they are professors, postdoctoral fellows, advanced graduate students in adjacent disciplines who really want to expand the breadth of their research interests. And I should say for me, it had, attending the 2012 seminar really had a very powerful and lasting impact on my own studies. So it's been a tremendous pleasure having Christian here for the semester. He will be here next year again in the spring, teaching again a cross-listed course in philosophy and Buddhist studies. So welcome Christian, who will be talking today on Neither One Nor Many, a case for the non-conceptual incoherence of the idea of non-dual awareness.
Thank you. It's indeed an extraordinary pleasure to have been given the honor to serve as Numata Visiting Professor to teach this course at Berkeley, a campus that I'm quite familiar with in large measure because I'm half of a Berkeley couple. Sheridan, my colleague and spouse here, is a Berkeley PhD graduate, so we've spent many times on the Berkeley campus. It's wonderful to finally be here in some official capacity, rather than just sort of coming and giving talks or visiting friends and old colleagues. So what I like to do today is sort of give you a sense and a flavor of the kind of work that people like us who wear two sort of hats, who do philosophy in this sort of cross-cultural or cosmopolitan key, do when we actually try to engage in dialogue with figures and texts that are culturally distant from what we're familiar with in the West, particularly in the analytic tradition. And the choice of topic is sort of grows out of an ongoing project. I'm working on a book for Oxford, an introduction to Buddhist philosophy of mind that should be due fairly soon. And in the last several years or so, 2 or 3 years, I got interested in this idea of liminal states of consciousness and exactly what it is that contemplative traditions such as Buddhism can contribute to that discussion, both in terms of sort of providing the empirical work, but more importantly, in terms of sort of the conceptual vocabulary that this tradition has developed, and how that might square with contemporary research in that area. So, and before I get any further, one of our dear old colleagues, Anne Jacobson, who is a Hume scholar but also doing philosophy of cognitive science, said that if you show pictures of kitties in your talk, you're more likely to get more citations. So this is sort of it's sort of a double picture here because I'm going to be talking about reflexivity. So I thought that it's quite appropriate to show that image. Anyway, so. There's been if you do just a regular search on Google Scholar or any sort of database, you're going to find dozens, hundreds, literally, of articles that explore the idea of non-dual awareness and also of minimal phenomenal experience. There are sort of robust research programs. People like Thomas Metzinger, for instance, has spent quite a bit of time in recent years arguing that there is such a thing as a sort of a minimal phenomenal experience, and that perhaps in some that minimal phenomenal experience even the most basic traces of subjectivity in some sense vanish. But the evidence is not quite clear that contentless experiences are in some sense possible, whether in fact they are indeed contentless. And so this led me to a project. Getting together a number of colleagues to explore this idea of whether subjectless consciousness is indeed possible. And this came out as a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies last summer. And I have a paper in there that I won't really be talking about it today, but it's sort of some of the ideas that I explore here grow out of that earlier work. All right, so here's the outline of the talk. It may seem like a lot, but I'm going to, the last sort of three points or so are basically just sort of summations of what I've said early on. So I'm going to say something about the concept of non-dual consciousness itself. The Sanskrit is there, Advaya Dhyana. I'm going to spend most of the time on the so-called Madhyamika challenge. Madhyamika, for those of you who are new to Buddhist philosophy, is the school of the middle way founded by Nagarjuna. And one of the things that the school puts forward is a series of arguments, including this argument, and neither one nor many arguments, which is an argument against metaphysical symbols. And then I'm going to look at the application of the argument or the extension of the argument to apply to mental phenomena. This is done by people like Dharmakirti and Shantarashta, among others. Some responses to that argument from some later Buddhist philosophers, Ratnakara Shanti and Jnanasrumita. And then I'm going to sort of switch gear a little bit and talk about some debates in contemporary analytic philosophy of mind and phenomenology about narrow content internalism and the problem of phenomenal unity. Of course, I'm not going to have time to go into details about that, but just sort of by way of trying to link this classical debates with some of the contemporary work. And I'm going to offer finally a sort of phenomenological challenge to the idea of non-dual awareness and its implications for Buddhist philosophy of mind as we practice it today, not as it has been practiced in the classical tradition or in India. So let me start with some disclaimers. The non-dual qualifier itself, it's variously taken to stand for various things. For instance, it's taken to stand for the absence of the subject-object duality typical of ordinary conscious states. It is also taken for a non-conceptual state of cognitive awareness, for a non-intentional or subjectless state of consciousness, and oftentimes it's taken to stand for a state of pure consciousness. There are various Sanskrit terms that translate the non-dual qualifiers: Advaya Jnana, Nirvikalpa Jnana, Nirakara Jnana. There's a huge body of literature, a contemporary literature that looks at non-ordinary experiences. This is empirical studies that include references to things like latent consciousness, the idea that there is a sort of a latent level of consciousness, minimal phenomenal experience, I already mentioned Metzinger's work on this, and also minimal conscious state for people who work, for instance, to do clinical work, look at sort of patients in a state of coma, vegetative state, and so on, where the idea is whether the state of mere wakefulness or alertness retains any sort of subjective elements or subjective dimensions. Now, non-dual consciousness is also typically associated with various affective and dispositional states, things like bliss. People experience states of bliss, and they think that in that sort of pure state of bliss, there's a sort of a dissolution of any sense of self. Oceanic feeling, full absorption. I think Dharmadina, he has spent a great deal of time this semester unpacking the implications of the states of full absorption, stillness, equipoise, and so on. I would not focus on the second part of on the contemporary literature. That's what we do in this. I did in the special issue on is subjectless consciousness possible. I'll focus primarily on the classical debate. One more disclaimer. I'm going to be using consciousness and cognitive awareness interchangeably and roughly as approximate analogs for Vijnana, and also I'm using conscious state and phenomenal state interchangeably as analogs of Chitta. All right, so much of what I'm going to be doing here sort of moves between what's called a metaphysics first and a phenomenology first approach. I would say that by and large, the Indian philosophical tradition, the Indian Buddhist philosophical tradition takes a metaphysics first approach to discussing the problem of consciousness and sort of the problem of consciousness and content. And I'm going to propose a phenomenology first approach that I think moves the conversation forward in interesting directions. So a metaphysics first approach essentially seeks a principal foundation for consciousness, right? So for consciousness to be ultimately real, it must be ontologically independent. Ontological independence, of course, implies simplicity or unity. And the simplest consciousness naturally is one that lacks the subject-object duality. So that's sort of how a metaphysics first approach proceeds. A phenomenology first approach, on the other hand, takes the phenomenal or the experiential character of consciousness as a given, right? So it starts from how it is that consciousness is experienced first personally. So a phenomenology first approach asks not what grounds conceptions of consciousness, as a metaphysics first approach would do, but rather what conscious experience is like, right? What are its structural features? So insofar as these features, things like subjectivity, intentionality, reflexivity, are structural, they are taken to be also constitutive. In other words, you can't have consciousness without these particular features, right? So to have consciousness, or to be conscious, is to, in some sense, exhibit these features or these dimensions, which is another way of saying that they are ineliminable. And that has implications for the very idea of non-dual awareness and non-dual consciousness. So let's start with the Madhyamika challenge, because the Madhyamikas are the first ones to really challenge the very idea of consciousness as a metaphysical symbol. All right, so, but in order to do that, I need to say a couple of things, not too much. I won't be taking too much time on the Abhidharma. So many, I'm speaking to an audience of people here who are experts in Abhidharma, know far more than I do. So please, forgive me for a rather simplified account here. So Abhidharma accounts of the fundamental building blocks of reality rest on this notion of dharmas, which are taken to be entities that exhibit intrinsic natures. The key word here is bhava. So what are these dharmas? Well, they're typically, because the Buddhists are dualists, at least the Abhidharmika Buddhists are dualists, they're taken to be either primary existence, given that bhava is a mode of existence, so it's a simple primary mode of existence, and they're taken to be a mereological symbol, an indivisible, partless unity. And there are two kinds of such primary existence. There are indivisible, partless atoms. So this is kind of a classical, atomist picture that's familiar to us in the West from Western atomism. But also indivisible moments of consciousness, so phenomenal primitives. Sometimes you can, a better way that's been sort of, or a better account of that in much of the contemporary literature is to think of them as tropes as well. But the Abhidhamma account of consciousness, of conscious experience, faces certain challenges. Given the Buddhist metaphysical commitment to momentariness, to things not enduring for more than a moment, and also given a metaphysical commitment to no self-view, how can one account for some of the structural features of consciousness? Particularly, how can one account for things like diachronic and synchronic unity? And that's sort of a big problem. So there are two responses here. So, assuming that there is such a thing as an experiential unity to our experience, to our conscious experience, that assuming that our conscious experiences are synchronically and diachronically unified, what it is that accounts for that. Now, even if these types of unity, let's say, as the Buddhist tradition sort of argues, are merely apparent or perhaps even illusory, an explanation must be provided for why conscious experience nonetheless exhibits these features. So simply say that they are illusory or the constructs is not enough. You have to say, well, how does that construct come about in the first place? And so the tradition sort of ventures various kinds of answers. They talk about things like Pudgala as a person, right? So there may not be such a thing as a self, a soul, but there's a person. And the person is a group of Buddhists, the personalists, who are quite a significant percentage of the Buddhist community in classical India. They did put forward this view, this personalist view. They didn't last. Eventually, they kind of wiped out for various other reasons, perhaps sociological reasons. But anyway, they said there are persons. They may not be selves as a metaphysical sort of souls of sorts, but they are persons, and they are neither identical nor different from the aggregates. Some put forward the idea that maybe there is some sort of a continuing stream of consciousness, where like a life continuum, this idea of Bhavanga Chinta. With the development of the Yogacara tradition, you have this idea of a storehouse or a warehouse or a subliminal consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana. But the one I'm going to be focusing mostly on today is this idea of reflexivity as a property or dimension of consciousness. The idea that the mind, or the conscious mind rather, exhibits a particular kind of dimension that makes each instance of awareness known to itself when it occurs. So the idea that the mind is in some sense naturally luminous. Now there is of course rich debates about whether any of these principles belong in the Buddhist ultimate ontology, and so the Buddhists debated at great length about whether this should be admitted at the conventional level but not at the ultimate level. So Buddhists were famously embrace parsimony. They love the idea of basically including as few elements as possible in the ultimate ontology. And so there were some debates about, whether any of these ones do belong in the ultimate ontology. There are also efforts, beginning with Asanga. This is one of the key figures in the foundation of the Yogacara school, to explain experiential unity as babies. I've been telling my students that babies exist in a state of constant, high. They kind of, tripping constantly because their experience is not yet differentiated. They are not yet at the subject-object, level. So So there are efforts by, as I said, people like Asanga to explain experiential unity as an outcome of the activity of a particular kind of mind. What I mean by a particular kind of mind means a particular aspect of the mind, a dimension of the mind, if you may, a so-called afflicted mind, klishta manas, which is the kind of dimension or aspect of the mind that's responsible for I-making tendencies, right? It's the part of our minds that that when we find ourselves caught up in, we brood and we obsess and about ourselves and so on and so forth. So it's responsible for I-making and self-grasping tendencies. But there's another response. That is, experiential unity does not demand explanation, right? And so the Madhyamikas, this middle way philosophers beginning of Nagarjuna, do not think that such apparently perceived unity needs an explanation. That is, the refutation of all things, of all natures, all things vibhava, targets not only selves and persons, but even consciousness itself. In other words, even consciousness itself is completely featureless, lacks any property of its own. There's really nothing about consciousness that's intrinsic to it. Everything that consciousness exhibits as a property is a result of the kind of causal and conditioning relations in which consciousness finds itself with other entities. So, for instance, from the point of view of this middle way philosophers, Madhyamikas, an awareness of blue is merely the effect of a causal chain of events, nothing more nor less. And there are a number of arguments that Madhyamikas put forward. I've listed them there. The only one I'm going to be focusing on in the remainder of the talk is the neither one nor many argument. All right, so in several places in his foundational text, the Foundations of the Middle Way, the Mula Madhyamika Karika, Nagarjuna argues that what we typically think of as two distinct things are actually neither one nor many. And he does this in several places in the text. So for instance, consider chapter 6, an analysis of desire and the one who desires. So basically he's trying to argue that there is just no way that you can think of one without the other. So in unity of state and subject, says Nagarjuna, co-occurrence is not possible. For it, that is the unity of desire, and the one who desires, is not together with itself. In distinctness, on the other hand, how indeed could co-occurrence possibly arise? So if things are distinct, right, you can't have co-occurrence. If things are united, you can't have distinction. Articulations of the argument are also found in other texts by Nagarjuna, for instance, in his Precious Garland, where he says things like, due to having many parts, there is no unity, there is not anything without parts. Furthermore, without one, there is not a many. Also without existence, there is no non-existence. So again, this is sort of purely relational view. All you have is just relations and relations of relations, and there are no relata, or no relata as self-standing or as essential entities possessing of intrinsic properties or qualities. So Nagarjuna himself doesn't really formalize the neither one nor many argument that happens later on, and the first Madhyamika to do that is Sri Gupta, philosopher from roughly about the 7th or 8th century, which gives us the first articulation of the argument in his Introduction to Reality. And it's fairly simply put, it sounds like this. In reality, everything that exists externally and internally lacks an intrinsic nature due to being neither one nor many, much like a reflection. So when you put the argument in the classical Buddhist form, Buddhist logical form, it would be something like this. Every existence lacks an inherent nature, that's the Pratijna. Whatever is neither one nor many lacks an inherent nature. All existence are neither one nor many, or if that feels a little weird, you can put it in the form of the Aristotelian syllogism. All things lack an inherent nature. Whatever lacks an inherent nature is neither one nor many. All things are neither one nor many. So that's the form of the argument. So let's try to unpack a little bit the argument. So the argument depends on three premises. Mereological simples are or must be ontologically independent, right? That's what it means to be a simple. It's a requirement, right, for being a metaphysical foundation. A one, or a unity, an eka in Sanskrit, and its opposite, the non-unitary, the un-eka, or many, exhausts all modes of being. So things are either one or many. There's nothing in between, right? A many is just a collection of ones, and vice versa. So the many is, in some sense, conceptually and metaphysically dependent on the one. You can't really conceive of the many without having the one. And so what the argument targets is this notion that there are such things as intrinsic natures, right? This is the key idea that the Abhidharmika spent a great deal of time. So Abhidharma, as a Buddhist philosophical project, is concerned with mapping out the physical and phenomenal domains. So, and it's a reductionist project. Basically says that things, if something can be broken down either physically by decomposing it, right, disassembling it, then it's not ultimately real, only its components are real. Similarly, so too for experience, if an experience can be reduced to something more basic, then again it's only the basic elements that are ultimately real. And much of the Abhidharma project is concerned with mapping out, as I said, the phenomenal and physical domains. Eventually they kind of run into all sorts of problems because they don't agree exactly how many categories are there. Ultimately there's huge debates, and eventually, as I said, Nagarjuna comes along and blows up the entire project. All right. So if one can show that there are no simples as conceived, that is, as ontologically independent, and by extension no multiplicities, then one has refuted the notion of an independently existing mereological simple, right? A svabhava entity. So that's what the argument is trying to do. It's trying to sort of, show the problematic nature of there being something that has its own essence or its own nature. All right. So that's all fine and good when it comes to applying the argument to objects, material things in particular. But does the argument also work in the case of mental phenomena? And so we're going to take a quick look and see exactly how the argument works when it's applied to mental phenomena. Some of the problems that it raises, maybe that there's some limitations to the scope of the argument when applied to the mental phenomena, some responses to that, and then we'll see how that goes. So Dharmakirti, influential figure, following in the footsteps of Dinagas, basically is sort of embodies the Buddhist epistemological tradition, or so is the representative of the Buddhist epistemological tradition, is the first one to extend the argument to apply to mental phenomena. And so here's a couple of passages that sort of representative of what he's trying to do. He says, singularity is not possible in the case of objects, such as, for instance, the butterfly's wing. So butterflies have variegated wings, colors, that have variegated appearances. How can there be a single cognition whose cognitive appearance is variegation, right? So in other words, you can't have a cognitive appearance, a cognition of something that's variegated, because cognizing each and every element within that requires an independent cognition, so to speak. This part of awareness, namely the one that is established such that it seems external, is different from the internal determination, which is part of the awareness that manifests as the subjectivity that apprehends the external parts. So again, plays on the idea that the awareness of the object depends on the structures or aspects of awareness itself. So awareness is not differentiated into two, says Dharmakirti, but its appearance is differentiated into two. In other words, it only seems as though there is sort of an object that appears and a consciousness that attends to the objects. In reality, that's not the case. So, says Dharmakirti, this dualistic appearance must be the result of some sort of a cognitive error. Now, Dharmakirti, at the same time, is clear that the subjectivity of awareness is not to be confused with its reflexivity, right? So the fact that awareness exhibits a kind of a subjective dimension, just as it exhibits an objective dimension, is not to be confused with perhaps some features that consciousness has some features that consciousness has that doesn't fall in either of those two categories. The subjective dimension is part of the merely apparent dual structure of awareness. The latter, however, reflects to what myself and several other people who work on this literature have argued is a formal and invariant, hence an intrinsic and perhaps undifferentiated dimension of awareness. Call it a field of presence, or reflexive presence. There are several ways that this is usually spelled out. So picking up on Dharmakirti, Sri Gupta, who is a Madhyamika unlike Dharmakirti, also extends the argument, the neither one nor many argument, to apply to mental phenomena. And this is what he says, again, in his introduction to reality. Due to lacking a cognitive object, non-dual awareness could not cognize anything else. Due to being non-dual, awareness could not cognize itself, right? Because if it's non-dual, it can't cognize itself. Upon examination, it cannot be correct that awareness is non-dual. Tell me, what other options are there? In other words, if it doesn't cognize an object, right, it doesn't cognize itself, right? These are the only two options, and so a non-dual awareness doesn't really obtain. So you really can't have the idea of non-dual awareness as a simple, because you couldn't do either of those things. So the arguments rest on the notion that conscious cognitions necessarily exhibit something. What do they exhibit? Directness towards an object, or what we now call intentional content. The Sanskrit there is akara, hence intentionality. So, and this is something that the Buddhist Abhidhamma philosophers recognized quite early on, that our conscious cognitive states are directed towards their objects or contents, and that directness, in some sense, is an intrinsic feature of conscious cognitive states. So, in other words, any consciousness with intentional content would not, in principle, meet the definition of a simple. Yet many Buddhists, the Sautrantikas, the Yogacarans, admit that awareness is ultimately non-dual, hence a simple. So what's going on here? Are there dogmatic commitments to non-duality get in the way of them being good philosophers, or at least good phenomenologists, or is something else going on here? This is what, in some sense, I'm trying this is the question I'm trying to answer here. So in other words, consciousness cannot be both asimple and intentionally contentful. So it is at this point that I feel like we need to bring in a new question, the question of phenomenal unity, which I'll get in a moment. So, if only a non-dual consciousness would in principle qualify as a simple, and if consciousness cannot qualify as such on account of its intentionality, then consciousness both lacks unity because of the variegation of its intentional content, and does not meet the fundamentality principle of ontological independence. So the question then is, are there good grounds for extending the neither one nor many argument to refute not only a material principle, right, essence, but also a phenomenal principle of unity, the givenness of experience. Now, Sri Gupta's refutation of material simples rules out the possibility of a material foundation for phenomenal unity. The question is whether consciousness itself or some structural aspect of it, other than intentionality, can ground phenomenal unity. Of course, I'm not going to be addressing that question here, but I'm raising it as a possibility in case that might come up in the Q&A. So, things get a little more complicated past this point, and they get complicated because Buddhists too embrace representationalism or indirect realism, because they realize quite early on that their commitments to momentariness means that they're committed to there being a time lag between the encounter between the sensory system and the object and the percept, the arising of the percepts. So momentariness commits them to there being a time lag between as I said, direct encounter with the object and the generation of the percept. And so then the question is, well, how do we account for that? What explains if representationism is the way to go? What does it mean to claim that consciousness is, in some sense, ultimately contentless or structureless or featureless? What it is that we're committing ourselves when we're doing that? So the key term here is akara. It's a big, key word in Buddhist philosophy of mind, and it's typically taken to stand for cognition's representational aspect or intentional content. And there are two positions here. The Sakara, which means that consciousness or cognitive awareness is always intentionally constituted or is aspectual, to put it in a more kind of contemporary jargon. It takes the form of whatever object or content it cognizes, regardless of the object's ontological status. So my thirst is always for a particular kind of beverage. My memory is always of a childhood experience. My anticipation is of a wonderfully delicious dinner, hopefully after this. I haven't had anything to eat since breakfast. Anyway, you get the idea. So even awakened individuals such as Buddhas are supposed to be conscious in this way, right? Then there is the near akara, or the non-intentional, that says that consciousness is not endowed with any kind of intentional content. And it basically says that all intentional content is apparent or merely apparent. So consciousness ultimately is pure and devoid of any such appearances. To the extent that such appearances are present, they are just false. The technical term there is alika. So the question is, does the neither one nor many argument target only the intentional content of consciousness, or does it also target consciousness itself? Is the argument meant to target certain aspects about conscious experience, or is it meant to target conscious experience itself per se? Specifically, its reflexivity or reflexive character, which makes consciousness something other than say, as Chandrasekhar put it, an insentient thing. So, the question then is whether consciousness and content are distinct or not. Now, for the radical Niracaravadians, consciousness ultimately lacks any content, so consciousness and content are indeed distinct. So you can empty consciousness of all its content. Intentional content does not truly exist as it appears. Its appearance is false. So neither one nor many argument targets indeed both consciousness and its content. Both of them lack svabhava. For the Sakaravadians, consciousness and its content are not distinct. Rather, that is precisely what it means for consciousness to exhibit intentionality. For consciousness to exhibit intentionality, it's for it to be directed in a certain way, to sort of make possible certain kinds of content. So blue and awareness of blue are not distinct. There is no blue qualia over and above our awareness of blue. It just doesn't make sense to talk, right, of anything that it's in some sense not an intentional object of consciousness. So for them, that is for the Sakaravadians, the neither one nor many argument can only target truly composite things, like material things. It cannot target mental phenomena because all intentional content is ultimately grounded in consciousness, in its reflexivity or luminosity. Consciousness is what makes possible, right, the directness of the mind towards various things. So no consciousness, no intentional content. So Bob mentioned that people like us who do cross-cultural, cosmopolitan, fusion, what's the other term? Comparative, confluence philosophy, that is, people who, much like we do when you do, say, classical or early modern philosophy in the West, when you engage these materials philosophically, you're meant to sort of take a stance. I mean, you're meant to argue on behalf of some positions and others, but this show that some positions are better than others. Not just presenting the views, but rather sort of, in some sense, taking a stand, saying that, well, some of these are instead better than others. So it's right for the purpose of an enterprise like this to ask the question, who is right here? So does the Niracaravadian have any good grounds for extending the neither one nor many argument to refute not only a material principle of unity, but also a phenomenal principle of unity? As we said, the middle way philosophers, the Madhyamikas' refutation of material simples rules out the possibility of a material foundation for phenomenal unity. It really cannot be a material basis for phenomenal unity, because there's none. Can consciousness itself or some structural aspect of it ground phenomenal unity? Could it be that looking at the material basis for phenomenal unity is just the wrong way to proceed, but rather we should look at structural features of consciousness itself that ground phenomenal unity? Now the Yogacaryans for the Yogacarans, the ground is provided by a particular aspect of the dimension of consciousness. As I said, it's reflexivity or luminosity. And so this is taken in some sense as a given. The idea is that, well, what sets apart conscious phenomena from other kinds of phenomena is that they have this capacity to make themselves present to the individual or to the mental stream where they occur. So consciousness by its very nature illuminates or makes known or makes manifest. So the example is the lamp, right? You don't need to point a torch to a lamp to make it visible. The lamp by its very nature, by its fact that it's luminous, it makes itself present. Now, anti-reflexivists basically use different kinds of valences or different kinds of metaphors. Usually they use the finger metaphor, say, the finger points to things, but it doesn't point to itself. The knife cuts a thing, an object, but it doesn't cut itself. So it depends on how your intuitions go here. But anyway, the question here is whether the singular illuminating aspect withstands the critical scope of the neither one nor many argument. And so here I just briefly want to take a quick look at Shantarakshita's framing of the argument. He basically says, those entities as asserted by our own schools, by the Buddhists and others, by the non-Buddhists, have no inherent nature at all, because in reality they have neither a singular nor a manifold nature. So this is kind of a rehashing of that argument we saw earlier in Sri Gupta. But unlike Sri Gupta, Shantarakshita, who straddles the Yogacara and the Madhyamika divide, argues that since intentional content, a patch of blue, let's say, can be manifold, right, shades of blue and so on, or gray, so also must the consciousness directed towards it. Why? Because to be singular, consciousness will have to apprehend only one object, and the existence of singulars or simples is precisely exactly what the Nom argument refutes. All right, so that's as far as the extension of the argument. So let me quickly look at a couple of quick responses from Ratnakara, Shanti, and Jnana-Sumitra, and then look at narrow content and the problem of phenomenal unity, and then have an argument for the conclusion there. So is there a grounding dimension of consciousness to which the neither one nor many argument does not apply? So there's, as I said, there's two responses here. For this, for Ratnakara, Shanti, philosophy that flourished roughly at the end of the first millennium, yes, that's luminosity, which is a Nirakara position. Intentional content, a patch of blue manifests only in light of consciousness's illuminating capacity, but does not account for the later's intrinsic nature. So it doesn't really tell you exactly why that's blue. It simply illuminates the blue. For the Sakaravatin, variegation is the criterion as a non-distinct form of consciousness. This is a Sakaravada position. Variegation suggests compositionality, but it is apprehended as such only because consciousness takes the form of whatever it apprehends. So variegation is a result of consciousness actually sort of holding all aspects of the object. So by taking the form of whatever it is that it apprehends, it's able to reveal its intrinsic nature, so to speak, right? So how do I know what pleasure is like? Well, it takes undergoing an experience of pleasure to know what pleasure is like. I can learn what pleasure is like by definition. Someone says, well, certain concepts you can learn by definition, but phenomenal concepts are not the kinds of things that we can learn by definition. So consciousness has to take the form of the object in order to reveal its intrinsic features. So it is at this point that we run into the so-called coherence problem. Is all consciousness off? Is all consciousness aspectual, and therefore it can never be non-dual? So if that's the case, then the Sakaravatin is correct that non-dual consciousness would lack both objective and subjective aspects. Unlike Madhyamikas like Sri Gupta and Dharmakirti, Sri Gupta, Dharmakirti argues that non-dual consciousness does indeed have an intrinsic property. It's reflexivity, it is reflexive. So reflexivity for Dharmakirti is not a relational feature. It's an intrinsic feature of consciousness. So is Dharmakirti in some sense, speaking to both ends of his mouth here or whatever, how can the non-dual consciousness make its illuminating or reflexive property known or manifest? And if that's the case, can a Nirakarian account for this intrinsic property be coherent. So what does it mean to be non-dual but reflexive? Here's a couple of brief quotations from Dharmakirti. The differentiation of phenomena is based on that subject-object distinction, and when that distinction is disrupted, their differentiation is also disrupted. There is no characteristic that exists externally in the form of the perceived and the perceiver. Therefore, due to the absence of the characteristics, they are revealed as devoid of intrinsic nature. This is what Dharmakirti says in his major work. But later on, Dharmakirti revises his thought and says, well, it turns out that consciousness does, even though we Buddhists are supposed to subscribe to the idea that consciousness is ultimately non-dual, because that's sort of almost a dogmatic commitment for us, we also have to come to terms with the fact that it exhibits certain features that seem ineliminable. So, says Dharmakirti, for someone who is not immediately acquainted with perception, that is, on an acquaintance account of perception, the perception of object is not established. That is, if I am not intimately aware of the kind of mental state I find myself in, I'm not aware of the object either. And there's a more interesting and longer quotation from his Pramana Vinishya. Awaiting the end of a series of successive cognitions, a person does not comprehend any object because cognition cannot be established as cognition when that cognition, which is first personally known, this reflexive awareness has not first established. And since the arising of cognition is without end, the whole world will be blind and deaf. For the series to come to an end, cognition's own ascertainment and its apprehension of the aspect of the object must be concomitant. In other words, I've argued elsewhere, and this is sort of part of an ongoing, long contemporary debate about whether higher order theories of consciousness or higher order thought or higher order perception theories can sort of circumvent this dilemma here. Whether they are, in other words, it's a huge debate in the Buddhist tradition that sometimes is reflected in contemporary debates between, let's say, higher order and same order or one order, theories of consciousness that say that consciousness is implicitly or intrinsically, there's no difference between consciousness and self-consciousness, or consciousness presupposes self-consciousness, where it's reflexively conscious, versus those who think that consciousness presupposes or consciousness is the result of a relation between two mental states, say a first order and a higher order mental state that attends to it in some form or another. I don't want to get into that whole debate, but if you have any questions, please raise that in the Q&A. So let me circle back to this idea of the metaphysics first approach and raise the problem of the conceptual coherence of non-dual awareness. So yes, the metaphysics first approach uses the mereological argument to target a conception of non-dual consciousness as a unity. But as I hope to have shown so far, the argument is limited in scope. It does not work as effectively for mental phenomena as its proponents might like it. Does that mean that Dharmakirti's defense of a conception of consciousness as reflexive yet non-dual is conceptually incoherent? As he frames the argument, it may indeed be read as a response to this Nirakaravaddins, the one who thinks that consciousness and content are completely separate, contention that consciousness and content are completely distinct. However, his account is also meant to address the otherwise quite trivial concern that considerations about the epistemic character of cognition upstage considerations about the ontological status of the object of cognition. In other words, the idea is we can't really get to the metaphysical part until we sort out the epistemic part. How it is that we can actually establish what cognition is or is like or is off very much depends on, in some sense, getting a grip on not just what cognition is about, but what cognition is also like. as I say here, there's no way to make sense of what we come to know without reference to how we know it. The lotus flower is only as seen, as drawn, or as imagined. All right, so quickly now to the whole, to see if there is some way in which we can draw on some recent work in analytic philosophy of mind and see if we can make sense of some of these debates. So let me say something about narrow content internalism. What is it? So it's internalism about mental content, which says that there are basically kinds of mental content, called narrow content, that are entirely determined by the subject's internal states. It's a way of saying that some mental content does not depend on features of the individual's environment or the individual's own constitution, their psychological makeup. It's a controversial position. There's lots of arguments against it, largely in light of some devastating criticism from Putnam and Burge and others. But it sort of continues to draw a lot of attention, and it's been sort of reanimated recently by people who do work at the intersection of analytic philosophy of mind and phenomenology. People like Lohr, Horgan, and Tinson, and most recently Uriah Kriegel and others. So the idea is that if there is such a thing as narrow content, it's got to be intrinsic. Think of the roundness of a penny, right? So the roundness of the penny is intrinsic to the penny. So there are two kinds of mental properties, argue people who put forward the view that there is such a thing as narrow content, phenomenal and intentional. The phenomenal properties are what it's like, the fact that conscious experiences feel a certain way, and the intentional is that, you know, what a mental state is about, its content. But the proposal from those who argue that there is such a thing as narrow content and who come from this sort of phenomenological tradition, or at least could draw from the phenomenological tradition, goes against the intuitions of most contemporary philosophers who've spent time arguing that there is no such thing as narrow content, that all of our mental content is a result of, is provided by factors in the environment, or factors that are external to cognition itself. So there is one view that says that phenomenal and intentional properties are separate, that what it is like and what it is about are completely different things. And there are others who argue that what it is like and what it is about are actually related. And people who put forward this phenomenal intentionality thesis argue that there is indeed phenomenal content. There is particularly phenomenal intentionality that is constitutively determined by the phenomenal character of a mental state. That is, a mental state provides all the content in terms of the phenomenology that's required. And this is a different kind of narrow content, phenomenal content, that depends on the phenomenology alone. So the Buddhist tradition spends a great deal of time talking about seeing blue. So on a typical Abhidharma account, there's a distinction between seeing blue as in the sense of having a blue quale, and the difference between seeing blue as in an encounter of a blue quale and bringing on the requisite category of blue. But on a narrow content view, the argument is that there must be some forms of non-conceptual, intentional content that makes it possible for us to deploy the requisite concept, right? Because otherwise, if we needed the concept in order to make sense of the experience, or to, in some sense, have even the ability to recognize the object or the phenomenon as such, we find ourselves into some sort of a vicious circle. So in other words, if there is narrow content, and if particularly phenomenal, there's phenomenal intentionality, what does that mean for the whole idea of consciousness being non-dual, and particularly for the reflexivity thesis? So recall again that another one of many arguments works against the idea of there being such things as essences, own natures. People who embrace that view, the Madhyamikas, are blocked, right, by the rejection of Svabhava from admitting that anything could possess its own determination or intrinsic character. So they cannot really admit, they cannot commit themselves to the idea that consciousness, that cognition, particularly conscious cognition, could have any kind of intrinsic revelatory or disclosing capacities. So being conscious is not any different than being unconscious. There's no difference between the sentient and the unsentient. It's all causal processes, causal continua. So if a conception of consciousness as reflexive awareness is compatible with a certain kind of narrow content, I argue, if it's compatible with phenomenal intentionality, then we can have unity without non-duality. That is, mental states can be phenomenally unified in ways that rule out the possibility that consciousness is ultimately non-dual or undifferentiated. So, briefly, let me consider in 5 minutes or so and wrap it up, the problem of phenomenal unity. What is phenomenal unity? It's a relation between phenomenal properties. That's one way to think about it. Or the way I've argued at length elsewhere, and many other people have made the same claim, is a structural feature of phenomenal content or of phenomenal intentionality. And there's two ways to think about it. By reference to phenomenal subjects. So what really unifies our experiences is they happen to a particular subject. Right? Every experience is an experience of a particular subject. But that would not really cut it for, let's say, Buddhists who are committed to the no-self view, because not only are there no selves, but there are no subjects of experience. So then we have to think about phenomenal unity in terms of a reference to structural features of the phenomenal space itself. Does the phenomenal space itself arranges itself in such ways that makes possible phenomenally unified experiences, even though the subject of those experiences is sort of transitory? There is, of course, a debate about what phenomenal unity is, and how extensive its scope is. Is it local, limited to certain conscious states, but not others? Or is it the global features? And of course, there are future questions about whether phenomenality presupposes phenomenal difference. Can I even talk about two experiences being phenomenally unified? So right now, I'm seeing people, chairs, I'm seeing people dressed in various kinds of outfits, I'm hearing sounds, and my experiences of people and their clothes and their gestures is in some sense unified, but is it unified because it's relative to other kinds of experiences where the contents are not unified, right? That I'm perceiving difference. So I'm seeing the people versus the objects in the room, the chairs and the walls and so on and so forth. In other words, is it the case that when I see an object, let's say, I don't know, that vent up there on a wall, which is round, right? Do I see the roundness and the color as two different things, or do I see them as one? Is my phenomenal experience of that particular object or that particular feature unified, and is it unified by virtue of being separate from some other experience, or is it unified by virtue of some intrinsic features that are proper to it? One way to address this issue, but this goes outside the scope of my talk, is to talk about things like the binding problem, but that goes well beyond what I'm trying to do here. Here, I'm simply raising the question of whether phenomenal unity presupposes phenomenal difference. Remember, I mentioned briefly in one of Dharmakirti's quotations there, that one of the questions that a Buddhist committed to the momentariness thesis faces is how can there be a single cognition whose cognitive appearance is variegated, right? So how can I have one cognition apprehending a multiplicity of things, or a thing that appears to have multiple features, the butterfly's wings? So we left with sort of one big question, whether there could be a way in which we could go beyond the neither one nor many to maybe a many in a one, right? Whether non-dual conception of consciousness may indeed be problematic because they do turn consciousness into some sort of a simple, a metaphysical simple that flies in the face of exactly how consciousness is experienced first personally, or how the phenomenal space maps out when we pay close attention to it. So proponents, for instance, of single-state conceptions of phenomenal unity defend mereological accounts of phenomenal unity. Tim Bain has written extensively on this, together with Chalmers and others. So he basically says things like, conscious states are phenomenally unified in virtue of the fact that they occur as parts of a single conscious state. No mention of subject here. Experiences are phenomenally unified with each other exactly when they exemplify conjoined what it is likeness. So there is a certain kind of character to the experience that makes it appear unified. Of course, this doesn't really address the metaphysical problem. And there's still lots of metaphysical questions. Vanya Visse has argued at length that people who put forward a phenomenal unity thesis do have to address these metaphysical questions, like, can a phenomenal state have phenomenal states as proper parts? Can there be subjective individuating criteria, and so on? But here what I want to do, by way of wrapping up, I want to offer a phenomenology first rather than a metaphysics first approach to the problem of phenomenal unity. So and it's also an argument in some sense against the view that says that consciousness and content are completely separate. So here it is, sort of by way of wrapping up things here, because we sort of running out of time. Non-dual consciousness lacks the subject-object duality. That is exactly what it means to be a non-dual consciousness. Consciousness, however, by definition is experiential. Experientiality entails phenomenal salience. To say about something that's experiential means that there's phenomenal salience. There being something it is like or feels like. Something seems or feels like only for someone or from some perspective for a subject of experience. Non-dual consciousness, of course, is meant to lack such a subject of experience. Non-dual consciousness, premise 6, is experientially without an experiencer. Experientiality without an experiencer is experienceless experientiality, which is a contradiction term. Therefore, the notion of non-dual consciousness is not conceptually coherent. Okay. So once again, the crucial element here is this idea that that there could be such a thing as experienceless experientiality, right? Because the idea of non-dual consciousness removes from consciousness those very features, those very characteristics that makes consciousness something distinct, something exhibiting a particular kind of nature. So a phenomenology first approach to the problem of non-dual awareness would look to the specific features of consciousness and say, look, if you do not take that into account, you're ending up with a case where you basically say that all the features of consciousness are provided by factors that are in some sense external to it. Now, that still leaves us with the problem of evidence, right? If you adopt a phenomenology first approach, means that you have to give full consideration to first person approaches. Are these accounts descriptive? There's plenty of literature out there in the Indian philosophical tradition, but also in the contemporary studies of contemplative, in neuroscientific studies of contemplative traditions that look at people describing what it's like to experience oceanic feeling or non-dual awareness, loss of any trace of subject-object difference. The problem, of course, is are these descriptions, metaphysically colored because people make these sort of commitments they're not aware of? Are they metaphysically inflected positions? Are even the descriptions themselves reliable? So all I'm saying at this point, I'm not passing judgment on that. All I'm saying is that the phenomenology first approach can offer or can function as a methodological constraint. That is, it can describe the contents of consciousness as experienced or as intended without worrying whether they are veridical or not, without getting into the metaphysics about whether they are or they are not subjects of experience. And so what I'm proposing is that we focus, when we adopt a phenomenology first approach, and we draw from some of these intuitions from the Buddhist philosophical traditions that went into that direction, but maybe didn't go so far because they were handicapped or held back by certain dogmatic commitments. So we can kind of pick up on some of these intuitions and see how far they could have gone had they sort of dropped some of those metaphysical commitments that were just primarily doctrinal in scope. So again, the focus should be on the accuracy requirement and ignore completely the existence requirement. So don't worry about what is the case, but rather how good is your descriptive, how good is your account of that particular mental state. So again, to wrap it up, given momentariness and the no-self view, of course, it cannot satisfactorily account for the unity of conscious experience and its subjective and intentional aspects. That's why the Buddhists in some sense fell short. There are two directions of development in the tradition: metaphysical arguments against metaphysical simples or unities, which dispense of the need to account for phenomenal unity altogether, and there are epistemic arguments for a unifying principle of experience, which place reflexivity and luminosity outside the purview of experience. So to conclude, while we have one of the questions that the Buddhist tradition presented us with is this idea that conscious experience has certain kinds of features that need to be accounted for, and they could not simply be accounted for in terms of features that are entirely external to it. In other words, it is not merely a question about that it was when I asked the question about whether non-dual states of consciousness are possible. It's not only a question about whether they lack phenomenal content, it's also a question about whether once attained, such states also lack any kind of givenness or reflexive presence. And this is where the tradition really, really struggled. On the one hand, it wants to account for the structural features of conscious experience. On the other hand, it's, as I said, it's held back by certain kinds of metaphysical commitments about what ultimately is the case. So yes, the neither one nor many argument does offer a metaphysics first critique of a conception of consciousness as a metaphysical simple or non-dual reality. But our answers, as when you consider these materials, must consider both metaphysical constraints, but also interpretive concerns about how such presumably unmediated experiential states could somehow be accounted for in epistemically relevant terms. So the Buddhists don't really have definitive answers. They didn't really address, or they didn't offer a satisfactory answer to the problem of synchronic and diachronic unity. But some Buddhists, those who embrace the idea that consciousness or conscious mental states exhibit certain intrinsic features, particularly this idea of luminosity or reflexivity, without which consciousness would be stripped of its experiential character, hinted in the direction that was in some sense that make them good companions to contemporary debates about the nature of and structure of consciousness and exactly the role that first-person approaches play in trying to map up the phenomenal field. So, with that, thank you. And again, there's the issue if you want to, dig in deeper about these debates. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. That was great. Could you go back to where you had the 7 premises and your logical argument was
Sure.
toward the end? Okay, so it's the 4th premise I wondered about. Something seems or feels like only for someone. And I just wonder, intuitively, that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it seems to me that part of what something seems or feels like could be that it feels like it's for someone, but that doesn't mean that there's a someone that's presupposed in the feeling like.
I see what you're saying. I mean, part of the whole Abhidharma project is the idea that dharmas, where mental states are free floatings, unowned, right, events. The problem, of course, is that to make that assumption is to kind of, raise the question: how do we know what the intrinsic qualities of those particular mental states are? How do I tell the difference between a pain event and a pleasure event and an exhilaration event and any other kind of event? How do I tell the difference between that without, in some sense, there being a kind of an experiential component to it? So the experiencing can only be the experiencing from somewhere or by someone, right? The someone can be, nothing but a very, very thin, minimal, subject. But you can't really, you cannot unpack the phenomenal character of the state in question without assuming that it's occurring for someone or in some mental stream.
Okay,
How else would you describe? How would you provide an analysis or a descriptive account of that state if it wasn't for?
the pain knows that it's pain.
The pain knows.
Yeah, the pain, it's a paining.
It's a paining.
Yeah.
And so on a scale of 1 to 10, how do I know whether it's an 8 or a 4 kind of pain?
Well, maybe there has to be a someone.
Wait
Wait a minute. Maybe there has to be a someone if they step outside and say, tell me how this ranks. But the pain doesn't care how I rank it. It's just a pain. It's a particular kind of pain.
But pain is only instantiated by individuals in particular kinds of painful conditions, right? There is no such thing as uninstantiated pain. What's an uninstantiated pain?
Right. So one of the characteristics, of the pain is that it's for someone, but that's a characteristic of the pain. It's not that the someone is there first. But I'll leave it.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I don't mean this tendentiously, it's just something that came up in my mind. In the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, where Shankara goes through each of the different views, and then he begins talking about the Nastika views, and there he's talking about the different kinds of Nastika Buddhist views, and then he gets up finally to the Madhyamaka view. This isn't worth thinking about. Mm-hmm. This is beyond what any thoughtful person, religious person would think about. But you characterize that view as having a I forget the exact word you used, but you were saying it's committed to something, and that is a problem because it doesn't allow it to see the nature of consciousness. So I guess I'm wondering what it was that Shankaracharya was seeing, perhaps whatever, and what it is that you see and why they're different. I don't know if that's so much a question or a comment.
Thank you. So this has to do because there's an entire school of thought in India, the Advaita Vedanta school, which is basically committed to the very idea that consciousness is ultimately non-dual. So it's a venerable school of thought, and so and the school that I mentioned here, I talked about the Madhyamikas, have a rather checkered history in India. They were by and large ignored by the mainstream of the philosophical tradition. They were even treated as nihilists. I don't want to go into that debate because there are people here who are Madhyamika sympathizers, and so I don't want to step on anybody's toes or offend any sensibilities. But right, so you're saying, did Shankaracharya see something completely different than, say, Nagarjuna and the Madhyamikas saw? What I meant to say is that the Madhyamikas do offer an interesting, argument about there being metaphysical symbols. And so you have to, in some sense, come to terms with whether the argument, how far the argument reaches. Does it, is it an argument that's restricted in scope? You can apply to certain kinds of things, but not others. And yes, part of the reason is that the Madhyamikas themselves do have this, you could say, almost doctrinal commitment. They think that there is no such thing as svabhavas, right? There are no such things as essential things or things that have their own nature. Abhidharma philosophers, by and large, thought that you could be a product of cause and conditions and yet have intrinsic features. So the examples I usually give to my students is things like, look, water under certain conditions at low temperatures freezes and becomes ice. Ice has the property of hardness, which is an intrinsic property of a block of ice. Yes, it's caused or it's conditioned by external factors to it, environmental, climatic conditions. But once those conditions are in place, new features, new intrinsic features are present in water. And so you can have both something that's a product of cause and conditions, and at the same time have or exhibit certain kind of intrinsic features. So I think this is a blind spot on the part of the Madhyamikas. I don't think ultimately the arguments really.
Hi, thanks so much. This was really interesting. Yeah, I guess just a couple of things. Just first on what non-dual consciousness means. The whole time the whole way through the talk, I was sort of understanding it as something like the idea of an experience that doesn't have a subject-object distinction, so it's non-relational in some sense. But then right at the end, you said it's an experience that lacks a subject as well, which seems like a different idea. So that threw me a little bit. I was wondering if you'd comment on that. And then the other thing was just assuming the idea of a non-dual experience is one that isn't relational. I was getting a little bit hung up just with my metaphysics hat on about the distinction between what's ultimate and what's non-relational and what's mereologically simple, and you had various other notions on the table there. I kept thinking that maybe these are different. So for example, I think a lot of metaphysicians would say you could have relational states of affairs that are nonetheless ultimate. Like you could have two particles that are a certain distance apart from each other, for example. And that could be an ultimate fact about the world, even though it's relational and it maybe involves two different simples connected in a certain way. So if you have that kind of picture, you could have a fundamental ultimate experience that nonetheless is relational and has a subject and an object. So it has internal structure, but it's still ultimate in some sense. So I was also thinking about that kind of...
Right. I don't think we disagree there. I think the point I'm trying to make, first your question about the subjective, right? So the way I understand the way the debate evolves is that there is this sort of metaphysical commitment to consciousness being ultimately non-dual. Why? Well, because it's part of the whole Buddhist project that what we're trying to do is trying to get to it's a reductionist project, so the only things that are real is that things that are not further divisible. Subject-object, right, is a duality, therefore it's not going to be ultimately real. It's decomposable into a subject and an object, right? And the question then becomes, well, anything that's decomposable is not ultimately real. What is ultimately real? Well, ultimately real are all these things that are point instance, right? Atoms or phenomenal types, and then you have another one of many argument against that. And the question is, well, is it the case that you can do arguments like that basically do away with there being the very notion of an intrinsic property or of something having an intrinsic character? And I think that when it comes to phenomenal experience, there is something about the phenomenal field that shows intrinsic properties that are that's not amenable to this sort of critique. Now, there's a difference between a consciousness that lacks a subjective dimension, a non-dual experience, and making the next move to say that consciousness lacks any kind of features altogether, right? The non-dual consciousness means a consciousness that is completely stripped of any kind of dimensionality. And I think this is where some Buddhist philosophers like Dharmakirti and others came forward and said, well, look here, that doesn't obtain, because we can't do anything. We can't get off. We can't do, forget about metaphysics. We can't even do epistemology. We can't engage in any kind of practices without presupposing there is a basis for cognition. And the basis for cognition is that mental states have a certain kind of structure, an intentional, but also perhaps a reflexive structure. Now, of course, you may call into question whether that's how it proceeds. Maybe higher order theories of thought have got a better account, but you cannot. The idea of consciousness as a purely undifferentiated, featureless state. It's conceptually incoherent, because consciousness, by definition, is experiential. Experientiality entails a kind of dimensionality, a sort of a directionality of the here and there phenomenal field. Is that answer your? That's helpful. Okay.
I think I'm next. Thank you, Christian. This is maybe this is a question which is based on some ignorance. Well, definitely is based on some ignorance. But the puzzle I was having is the concern with non-dual consciousness a dedication to the idea that really, appearances notwithstanding, all consciousness is non-dual, or is it an interest in the idea that among the different kinds of experiences that there might be non-dual experiences or non-dual consciousness, and indeed we might cultivate in ourselves the ability to, if not actually fully achieve it, but at least aspire to it and move towards it. And so in that sense, you could think that maybe there is something finally incoherent about it, but still think it's worthwhile working towards it.
Right.
So anyway, there's different options there.
No, thank you. That's an excellent question. Thank you, Alba. I mean, so yes, this is like the question of nominal unity. Is it local or global, right? So are there like cases where there are sort of, occasional, completely non-dual experiences, but they're not typical, right? And so because of some kind of their valorization in a tradition, they become kind of the norm, that this is what I'm supposed to strive for, and therefore they take center stage in the tradition, and then of course from just becoming a state that one experiences occasionally, it becomes kind of posited when approached metaphysically, it begins sort of to be, that's exactly what consciousness ultimately is. It's sort of ultimately non-dual, and everything else is sort of a projection or a distortion of that consciousness field, or of the nature of consciousness. So my response to that is to say, yes, I think a lot of this stems out of a kind of, we could say, experience, a range of varieties of experiences that people had, right, in this tradition and other traditions. And the notion that, I'm experiencing something that's very rare, very rarefied, right? These are sort of states in which there seems to be a complete loss of a sense of self, like maybe just an open space, and these experiences feel extraordinary, maybe exhilarating. And the next step is to say, well, these are not anomalous experiences. These are normative experiences in the sense that they ground what consciousness actually is, and everything else in some sense is a distortion of this particular conscious experience, fundamental conscious experience, and then that sets the norm, and then everything, the practice is meant to do just that. So Buddhist meditation then, and any other kinds of contemplative practice, serve as tools to reinforce that particular norm. What I'm saying here is that experience itself, the so-called non-dual experience, is problematic as described, because it takes, even when you say that you have a purely non-dual experience, well, presumably you're reporting that non-dual experience. Reportability entails some kind of a minimal subjective presence to the experience, right? So how do you know that you have a non-dual experience? Right? You can't say by inference, right? I mean, I wasn't aware because there was no subject there while I was having the experience, but now that I'm aware, I think I had the experience, and that just won't cut it. So what I'm claiming is that while minimally conscious experiences and minimally subjective experiences can seem like non-dual experiences, they're not actually, the idea of purely non-dual, purely featureless experiences in some sense a category mistake. That's what I'm actually.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
I just want to take the prerogative of asking a question here and represent the Madhyamikas, for example.
Sure,
for a
go
moment.
ahead.
So neither one nor many, the way I understand it, take the typical examples that they would use is the sprout, the seed
This
and the
is a
sprout,
sprout.
or the walker and the walking, or in all these.
Desiring, desiring.
The argument here is that you can make a distinction between one and the other, but it's always a conceptual imputation. The distinction is not given to you. So they make the same argument with the knowing and the known. That's also, and that's why I think, from a Madhyamika point of view, what it means that it's non-dual is that any distinction you make between the subject and the object is always a conceptual imputation. So and this question I think you answered in your talk, but it went by quickly. Why doesn't that apply to reflexivity? Dharmakirti still talks about the pramana and the prameya and the pramanapala. So why doesn't Nagarjuna get to say, well, you can do that if you want, but these are they're artificially after the fact conceptual lines you're drawing. In and of itself, there are no lines that exist there. There are no lines that pre-exist your conceptual imputation.
So
It's really, why does reflexivity escape, but subject-object duality doesn't?
yeah, I've argued, so in I think you were at that conference in Taipei some years ago, so I've argued about, I said like the one way to understand why is it that, that reflexivity doesn't lend itself to kind of typical conceptual analysis is because concepts like that are phenomenal concepts, and phenomenal concepts are grounded in phenomenal experiences, and so I used the phenomenal concept strategy to sort of make sense of that, and then I said, look, things like, most of our concepts, particularly concepts of things, some of them can be fixed by definitions. Obviously, most of our scientific concepts are fixed that way by definition. But when it comes to concepts of experience, I can learn the concept, but I don't have the meaning of the extension or the reference of the concept without the experience. So I can't really know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about pain. So if we go back to the first example here. So I can, or maybe just forget about it. Let's just go back to the Mary, the colorblind neuroscientist, right? So Frank Jackson's argument. So Mary obviously is a brilliant neuroscientist. She knows everything there is to know about color, right? How brain processes visual information and all that, but she's never experienced color, right? So does Mary know what color is or is like, and so on and so forth? Does she have the phenomenal, knowledge of color? And so most people would say, no, she doesn't. That, being liberated from her black and white world, experiencing color for the first time, adds something that she couldn't possibly have had otherwise. Now, you might say, there are people who don't buy that argument. They think that, and Frank himself, sort of oscillated, moved back and forth between whether the knowledge argument really plays the way it does. But what I'm saying here in the case of reflexivity is that what prompts Dharmakirti to take the line that he does is to say, look, you can have an objective and a subjective aspect. You can have the instruments, right, the object and the phala, the result, without there being certain sort of structural features to cognition that are not just a product of relations that are public concepts, as it were, stand to each other. So that would be my response to that.
Thank you very much for the talk. I may have misunderstood you, but according to what I heard, it seems like you're critiquing more the statement of non-dual consciousness instead of non-duality itself. Because, going back to the premise number 7, you say experientiality without experiencer is experienceless experientiality, which is a contradiction in terms. For this, it to me only works if you take consciousness with the set definition that you give in the very beginning. Consciousness is some sort of experience phenomenologically. But if you take that away, just from the standpoint of non-duality, you can just revise the premise number 7 into experientiality without an experiencer is experienceless experientiality, which is the paradox that the Prajnaparamita embraces. So I think for this, if you just take away this postulate in the beginning, then this becomes exactly what the Buddha is trying to point to. Yes, so I just wonder what you think.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so in other words, so why assume that consciousness is experiential in the first place? Is that what you...
No, I'm just asking, is that what you're trying to do?
Yes, that's what I'm trying to do. Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to argue that there is, and first of all, I'm trying to, well, there's lots of things. There is an asymmetry between the intentional and the reflexive aspect of consciousness. And I am trying to argue that let's say arguments that work for material compositionality do not, and arguments that work, for composites, the kind of neurological arguments that we use in order to say that things are neither simple nor many, do not work when it comes to our phenomenology. That's kind of the gist of it.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. So I don't know about Dharmakirti, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding is, first of all, when the Yogacarans started denying the externality of the object, the artha, what they do basically is, okay, so when we cognize what seems to be an external object, what's actually happening is there's a moment of cognition that has two parts, right? There's an image part, there's a seeing part, right? The darshana bhaga and the nimitta bhaga. And then once they introduce this notion of the svasamviti, that becomes the third bhaga, the third part. So to me, it seems like even without the svasamviti, just by dividing thought, a thought moment into two parts, that's already opening up to the neither one nor many argument from the Madhyamikans. Because now they can just say these two are not one because now thought has parts, now it's a composite thing, and it's also not many because one cannot exist from the other. So I wonder, it just seems to me that even without the self-reflexivity, that's already a problem.
For the Yogacara.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And so the question is does Svasamviti itself fall into either of that? I mean, is it like a third, as you said, is it the third bhaga, or is it the third element? The way Dinagar, I mean, of course, there is this debate about whether Svasamviti or Svasamvedana, the reflexive nature of cognitive states, is itself an extra dimension of cognition, or it's just an aspect, as I said, is it a formal and invariant feature of all conscious cognitive states, or is it itself a state of its own? I claim that it's a formal and invariant feature of all cognitive states that makes them the kind of things that they are, and not its own separate thing. Now, does subscribing to the idea that conscious cognitive states are differentiated into a subjective and objective aspect, does that mean they're exposed to the yes, I think that's true. But at the same time, they want to say that because they have this commitment to cognition, conscious cognition, let's make that clear, having this intrinsic property of reflexivity and luminosity, that somehow it escapes the neither one nor many, the scope of the neither one nor many argument. And now, of course, again, this, you see how later on with the Niyakara Sakara, the debates, if you subscribe to the idea that content is separate from consciousness, then obviously the neither one nor many argument applies. But if you think that no, that content is indistinguishable from consciousness, you can't have in other words, the intentionality is not a extra feature of consciousness, but rather an intrinsic aspect of it, then the scope of the argument, then the argument doesn't really apply.
One more very quick question,
Okay.
and we'll give you a break.
Thank you, Professor. My question is maybe silly.
No such thing as any questions?
Okay,
No,
thank
no.
you. So my question is not about the debate here. I'm wondering, in your talk, the concept self-awareness is the same thing is non-dual awareness is the same idea with non-dual consciousness? Because in Taoism, Asian philosophy, we value a lot about non-dual awareness. So for me as a student, I'm more interested about self-development, self-improvement. So I'm wondering how can I use today's talk to be more beneficial for my life, and I want to get a higher consciousness.
No. This is not. No. You should not use today's talk for self-improvement. This is not. This is not exactly. This is playing the exact opposite role. It's meant to shake you up and to make you question, the very path that you're on, if you are on any path at all.
Thank you very much. That was
Thank
wonderful.
you. Thank you.